We're here talking with Batavia artist Roberley Bell here in her part of the installation for Beyond in Western New York. And before we talk about the work that's on view here, I wanted to talk about what I think is fascinating in terms of a shift to this work, which is the last few years you've been doing a lot of outdoor installations using real flowers and real vegetation and real nature, and sculpting that. I wonder if you could talk about that for a while and where that came from in your work.
To not give him an essay, because he doesn't want one.
I know, I asked an essay-length question.
I would say that because this was brought up when I was talking to the students, someone remembered a project that I did in Buffalo, and it was about 15 years ago. So if we go back really quickly, about 15 years ago, I was, for quite some time, involved in this idea of the domesticity of space, and really used the iconic image of the house as a framework for those projects. I also used wallpaper, and historically wallpaper has been this idea of being able to bring the image of nature in. But architecturally, the interesting thing is that wallpaper becomes the skin of the wall, and the wall is that which separates us from, quote, nature. And I put nature in quotations there. I turned from there to the view from the window. And this understanding that the garden is, in fact, the extension of the domestic realm. It is this space that we control and nurture as an extension of the interior. And that's how I kind of got into this gardening thing. In the garden, my projects always mediate between the real and the artificial, because I do use real plantings, and I do work in a constructed natural environment, a park, a garden, historic garden perhaps like Wave Hill. But I bring in artificial elements as well, astroturf, artificial flowers, and kind of juxtapose the real with the artificial in the sense that what happens is that it focuses our attention to the artifice of what it is we perceive as being real nature. This work, the flower blobs, was a very intentional move by myself to want to re-enter the gallery, to want to come back inside. The pieces are very informed by nature, by this exploration or investigation that I've had with these ideas about landscape, but also by something very current, and that is blob architecture, a movement that's been around about a decade now. And blob architecture was coined by the architect Greg Lynn in California. And what interests me about this idea of blob architecture is it appears as if something comes from the natural world, but it's not. It's drawn in a computer program. And that in and of itself interested me, and this idea of maybe thinking of blob design as being this 21st century version of organic abstraction, of a Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth. So these forms don't appear in nature, but they reveal themselves as if they could be some kind of natural form. So I really wanted to make these interior pieces that somehow continue this idea of the spills that I do in the landscape, but in and of themselves speak in a little bit different language. Is kind of something that I'm thinking about for an interior space that perhaps has a concrete floor, but to actually float them so that very quality that you're talking about, like that they have that animation, that they have that sense of almost being the body, that you would have that kind of continuous motion. So it is something that I think about.
Well, you photographed them floating on water. You sent me some images of that.
Yeah. That piece is in a pond in Connecticut.
It's still there?
Yeah. It's a year-long project So it'll be quite interesting what happens come
Is
winter.
it fenced in? How is it staying within a certain area? Is there?
They're all tethered.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're all tethered, so they have movement. The pieces on the inner tubes, they don't have a whole lot of movement. They maybe have a 5-foot. Then there were little islands with pinwheels. They have like a 30-foot tether. So when the wind catches them, they all just like move in formation. And then there were ducks, decoys, that also had a long tether. So they tended to really bring the whole thing to life. So where the big pieces had a very limited tether, everything else was really moving. So every time you saw it, it was different. And you had some sense of the environment because they were being directed by the wind.
I think another thing is the different kinds of artificiality we have here, because I should just do this and maybe we can hear our little mechanical birds that are part of it. Which, you know, it's been funny watching the audience with that, because they're something that simple, that little kind of a cheap trick. People get really enraptured by them, you know, in really interesting ways. And yet behind you, as we can see, there are a whole host of real butterflies. You know, now, arguably, I guess they're fake butterflies, but there are different layers of artificiality at work.
The birds behind me, the idea there was that I wanted that element of surprise. So I wanted somebody to be looking at one of these, and then someone else would be in the sensor range, and suddenly you would be hearing this bird. So I thought that in this kind of long, narrow venue, what would work to my benefit is to have something in motion, something that had this idea of kind of fluttering across, of kind of swarming and then dispersing. And my choice to use the real butterflies as opposed to artificial butterflies, which I had purchased at first, was, again, wanting to bring something from the outside in, but also kind of the history of the preserved butterfly is something that we collect. They're like souvenirs of nature. And I often joke about these pieces as being my little souvenirs, you know, that they encapsulate everything from nature, and it becomes this little souvenir like a snowball.
We're here with David Clayton, artist from Syracuse, New York, and we're sitting inside his installation, NORAD 2.0, which is a piece that I'm going to be sorry to see deinstalled today. I didn't have a laptop, or I would have spent the last month sitting inside here. It's been part of our Beyond in Western New York regional biennial exhibition, and we're just going to talk a bit about this piece. But we're going to start a little earlier, because obviously you didn't have anything like this constructed when we did the studio visits. When we came and visited you in Syracuse, we were looking at a lot of small, discrete, very, you know, beautifully rendered model pieces, little mobile, imaginative worlds that you had concocted. And even though we have one in the gallery here, you know, obviously this is a scaled up version of that kind of thing. What prompted you to want to build a mountain?
Well, I think the work just started to, maybe like 2002, 2003, it started to shrink. And it got really comfortable, and I could be really meticulous. And then it became sort of an end game where, like, I figured out how to make a successful miniature sculpture. I just kind of put all the ingredients in the pot, mixed it up, and out would come this, really beautiful imaginary world in a suitcase perched on a shelf. But I really hate repeating myself in some ways. Like I hate the idea of, start getting into making widgets.
I mean, you had a number of those pieces, so you just get to the point where it was almost too easy to keep making them?
Yeah, and I mean, I was in grad school at the time, and you get a lot of shit for that, where it's like and I guess in some programs you don't, but definitely at Syracuse I got not a lot of flack, but just a warning of don't get into this groove. And I feel like when you figure out the formula for success, you kind of exploit it. And so I tried to loosen up the things I was making, and gradually they started shifting in size to more large tabletop size to then these large towering 14-foot sculptures.
Well, now you had the NORAD 1.0. I think that you had that when we were.
I think that was in process.
Done.
Yeah, and that was like the stripped down version of this. It's the fortress, but then I guess this is what would be inside of the other NORAD.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting trajectories to trace. One of them is a physical one. I don't think that your work is about landscape, but it has, there are formal connections to landscape. In those miniature pieces, they're all, physical scenes. They're plateaus, or there's a cloud, or, and even here where you've got the small, discrete lead mountaintops that you built with, or mountains with the little styrofoam tops, that then get a little bigger, as you say, to the tabletop, or the one we have out here on wheels, and until we get to the size of a mountain that we're sitting in. So landscape and terrain and location seem to have some part in your work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the kind of expansiveness of Americana, and being from the Midwest, there's this, I'm always connected to this idea of landscape, and kind of creating maybe an alternate version of those, or a more ideal version, or my version. But I feel like I don't know how to say this. My connection to landscape is heavily based on memory and nostalgia, and kind of a nostalgia that really isn't mine to have. It's almost like I'm lifting memories from other times.
It's a borrowed nostalgia.
It is, yeah, and it's kind of I take my NORAD 1950s kind of Red Scare idea, and then I mix it in with this 1980s pop culture, which I think is it's still a little bit unsettling mix to me, but I think it's quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting that you reference those two eras, the 50s, the 80s, yet you mix them together, and the kind of texture of radical frontierism, or what you might want to call it, is completely apt today. I mean, when you were building this, I think you called it your Generation Y neocon paranoid fantasy house, or something like that. So it seems entirely apt, and you were talking to me about a neighbor of yours that was sort of feeding some of these ideas, because they were from an older generation, but they had this sort of slightly paranoid American mentality.
Yeah, I mean, my neighbor, and I have an uncle also who is the type who listened to a police scanner as a form of entertainment, which I think is quite interesting that, you know, even though the TV's on, the police scanner's on, and the police scanner kind of supersedes the television when something important is on the police scanner. If there's some large fire or big event, you know, then, and my neighbor is the type of person who actually goes to, you know, uses the police scanner as a way to go and kind of, you know, be a voyeur to these events. And I think, I mean, that's something I really haven't exploited yet, but I like that, that kind of the voyeuristic aspect of like paranoia culture, like really wanting to peek in to see the kind of, you know, the more real version of reality TV.
And it's funny to me because that sort of sensibility emotionally, it actually has a connection formally to things you've done in your work where there is, you know, this sort of not quite haphazard, but not quite orderly kind of clutter or collection of objects and icons.
My, you know, my family history is, you know, my grandparents grew up in the Depression era, so they didn't throw anything away. That was partially passed on to my parents, but they have, you know, kind of rejected that in some ways not. But, you know, I really latched onto that idea of, especially, you know, handmade things, like the idea that someone, you know, someone actually made this thing, or it has a real history, it has like a richness to it, that's not just kind of a, you know, a prepackaged widget.
More than a few people have noticed, and it's very charming, that your installation, apart from anybody else in Beyond in Western New York, ended up looking exactly like you sketched it, and as it appears in the catalog, which I think is funny, but is also kind of interesting, like an interesting clue to how clear you are about how you want it to appear visually, you know, your concept.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I did the sketch, I did that sketch, or the original sketch, the one you saw for my first studio visit. I did it incredibly quickly. It was kind of this maybe 10-minute sketch where all of the stuff, well, actually, the beehives and the bear were sort of complete in terms of how I wanted them to look with that 10-minute sketch, all of which I kind of did very quickly. They were on the stools, they were on the platform, there was a different kind of flower, but other than that, it was pretty identical. And then I did that longer sketch, the sketch that was in the catalog. It was a considerably sort of more detailed sketch, but at that point, the idea was even kind of more solidified. And so I think that even I took that maybe as I developed that second sketch, everything came together visually for me, and after that I really thought of it as the kind of the model. I mean, the only thing that changed between the sketch and the actual installation were textures in terms of the two sort of larger installation pieces. So for example, the texture in the cloud was added a little bit later because I wanted there to be something visually there that I didn't include in the sketch, and the texture in the beehives was always there in my head, and so you didn't see that in the sketch when in fact it was developed here. But I think even in the sketch there was the stitching on the side of the beehives. I think I included that, and so that when I was actually creating them was the last thing I did. It was kind of the finishing piece, but I felt like it was really necessary. But I was pretty happy with the fact that I think that the dimensions of things and the color key, I think, of things. Everything kind of
Yeah, the proportion of all the parts to each other, and
Yeah,
it's really interesting, actually.
Yeah, I felt like I really wanted to stick to that at the same time as I was kind of playing with the idea of making things longer and moving things. It all, in the end, really came back to working as it appeared in the sketch. Like the proportions felt right to one another and to each other. So I just kind of worked with them, I guess. In my work, I always sort of what I'm presenting to the viewer is actually pretty personal information. It's pretty personal observations that I've made, and when I present them, I put them through this kind of. I sort of separate them from the personalness of the actual ideas by sort of using as much artifice as I can. And so I think the ideas themselves go through that because I think it sort of gives me a little bit of distance. It's almost like a protective step. And I also like the fact that I like to sort of turn up the color and the texture and the beauty of what I see as beauty at the same time as kind of grotesque beauty, I guess, of the objects or the spaces that I'm creating. I always have been I've been a fan of kind of Baroque work, and I think that specifically Baroque decoration. So I've always loved the kind of ridiculous, over the top kind of appearance of that kind of decoration or ornament. And so I like to put that in because again, it takes it a step further. It takes it into this realm where hopefully it feels a little more precious and also a little more uncomfortable or strange or foreign. And it's this constant struggle. I never want to make work that is, I'm well aware that my work has an element of cuteness to it. And but I don't want to sort of forcefully try to make it weird or make it, disturbing. But I always hope that kind of emerges as I make the work, that there's a layer to it that's beyond just being cute. I mean, especially when I was making this work, I realized I'm making a big blue bear costume, this big sort of huggable thing. And in making it, there's sort of always this sort of voice in my head saying, is it too cute? Is it, I don't want, I want there to be layers or aspects of it that hopefully read as something else, and so I always hope that I guess that comes through too, and I think that that artifice lens maybe helps me lend it that edge that I'm looking for.
Well, cuteness is a very funny word to use because in fact I think the bear couldn't be more full of pathos, despite the fact that it's this luscious, gorgeous blue fur.
Right.
And I think of certain things that undercut that element of cuteness, like when these walls were starting to be painted, we stood here and we kind of agreed that, well, that's kind of a slightly sickly shade of pink.
Sure.
It's a little off, it's a little unsettling.
Right.
It creates a little bit of a disturbing undercurrent, a tone that really, it's funny that you said cuteness, because I don't think thinking about the work that I've ever thought of cuteness.
I'm glad.
I have thought, though, thinking back to a piece you did at the Birchfield in which you built a hibernation chamber, a really beautiful box in which someone could, exist for a time, and you built a kind of a skull cap that was connected to all these
right.
couple dozen bird houses that were all made by other artists, by friends. So there was this iteration of a longing for connection and for some sort of, you know, emotional bonding with other people, which
Right.
seems like it's an idea that's replicated here with the bear that is rather forlornly looking into the mirror,
Yeah.
holding some candy in its
Yeah.
paws. But, you know, a few feet away we have, you know, a set of beehives, not unlike a set of birdhouses
Right.
that are, you know, have an offering within them. So
Right.
it seems like there is, you know, that's another theme that's running through the work that you're making.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's the case. I mean, I think that the ideas, you know, I describe them as kind of coming from this very personal place, but I always want them to be accessible for the people seeing them. Like I want the ideas to kind of be a kind of very large metaphors in one sense, and then maybe smaller ones in another. And I do think, you know, these sort of connections keep popping up as I make work. The repetition is certainly here that I think you saw in the beehives, and this sort of participation in this case where the candy's here and people sort of were taking it. And I'm happy that I'm sort of presenting it as this way to connect, for sure.